All right, good morning. We are
Did you see the?
in the process of going through the 10 Commandments, and we have arrived at the 5th commandment, which is kind of a mixed both success and disturbing slowness of pace, but that's on me more than anything. So we've been talking about the 5th commandment, which is the Sabbath commandment, and we have in Exodus chapter 31, we won't read all the way through this again because we looked at this last week, Exodus 31, where God institutes the Sabbath as an official day of rest from work. The term Sabbath had been used in the little s Sabbath previously. The word Sabbath has a meaning beyond simply the name of the 7th day of the week according to the Jews. It's a broader term that refers to the idea of a rest day, but God establishes it as the official capital S Sabbath in Exodus chapter 20 when he talks about it in the 10 Commandments, and he explains it in Exodus chapter 31 further, and institutes a death penalty for violating the Sabbath, which, as with most of the 10 Commandments, was the case. But when you think about it, it's kind of interesting because it's an unusual society that says that if you work, we'll kill you. Well, usually it's kind of the other way around. If you don't work, we'll kill you. So, or at least you won't survive. So the Sabbath day is given significance, and a lot of that significance we talked about yesterday is because it is a covenant, and because it ties into a thing that God had done when he rested from creation. And so it's a matter of honoring God. When we look at the first 5 commandments, we've talked about this in passing a few times. When we look at the first 5 commandments, all 5 of them have to do with honoring God in one way or another. Not having any gods before him, not taking his name in vain, not engaging in idolatry. All of these things are about honoring God. And the Sabbath day is also about honoring God. Now, it has a secondary purpose, and it kind of leads into the next group of commandments really well, because it also has an element of honoring man. As Jesus says, man is not made for the Sabbath is made for man. The Sabbath is designed to give man an opportunity to rest, to step away from the busyness of life, from work, from those kinds of things, and to have a time to sort of rest and relax and focus on his spiritual needs and on God in particular. So all of these things are tied into this idea of the Sabbath. All right, any comments or thoughts before we move on? Yes?
The thing you just mentioned, it's also an opportunity on the spiritual side to work on your relationship. And one thing about relationships, they need to be worked on. They need time devoted exclusively to that relationship. So the Sabbath gives the individual Jew and the community as a whole that opportunity to strengthen their relationship with God.
Yes, that's right. And interestingly, the term Sabbath is going to be associated not just with the 7th day of the week, but also with those high holidays where there is no work to be done as well. Again, tying very much into that idea about the idea of being able to focus exclusively on God during those time periods. So,
and it even gets extended to the land, the Sabbath year's rest.
That's right.
In their farming.
Now, in modern farming, we know the reasons for that. The underlying agronomic, material, physical reasons for that. That giving the land a rest, rotating your crops, these are things that help to sustain the viability of the land. But for the Israelites, this combination of a physical action tied into a spiritual concept is not at all unusual, and is something you see quite frequently in the Old Testament and certainly in the New Testament as well. Okay, so the Sabbath applies in some very broad ways. And in some situations, particularly in the situation of the Israelites as they were wandering through the desert, God actually made allowances and did miraculous things in order to sustain them and give them what they needed in order to be able to honor the Sabbath. The most notable of all of those has to do with the manna that God gave them from heaven. So in Exodus chapter 16, we have this situation, as they often did, the congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The sons of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt. This is, by the way, this is like 2 months into the whole thing. Like, they arrived at Sinai by no more than 3 to 4 months after they left Egypt. And so this is literally like 2 or 3 months into this, and they're whining. Would that we had died by the Lord's hand in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, when we ate bread to the full, because I'm sure that's how it went when they were slaves in Egypt. They just got to eat as much as they wanted to, you know. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. And there's probably, I don't know, Moses is the most humble man on earth, but I think Aaron might have been thinking to himself, you know, I would kill you if I could right now. But anyway, so then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether or not they will walk in my instruction. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. This is what, so Moses goes back to the people and he says, this is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it every man as much as he should eat. You shall take an omer apiece, according to the number of persons each of you has in his tent. And I forget, an omer is like a quart or something like that, yeah. And remember, this is their food for the day, so it's not like you're just going to get a little wafer like we do at, you know, at the Lord's table and think that's enough to eat. So the sons of Israel did so, and some gathered much and some little. When they measured it with an omer, he who had gathered much had no excess, and he who had gathered little had no lack. Every man gathered as much as he should eat. Moses said to them, let no man leave any of it until morning. But they did not listen to Moses, because that was their favorite game to play in the wilderness. And some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. And Moses was angry with them. Why would they be not supposed to leave any until the next day?
I think like today, they were kind of hoarding. They were afraid the next day it might not be there, and then I'm hungry.
Mm-hmm.
We were trusting
It's just a human thing. You know, I need to have enough.
Right. I want to be in control.
Mm-hmm.
We keep coming back to that, don't we? When we talk about, you know, how commandments and God and this, I want to be in control. You know, so I've got to take more, and that's why there's a limit. Don't take more than an omer. Don't take as much as you would need to eat, because if you take more than you need to eat for a day, you're going to want to keep it till the next day, and you're not trusting God. And if you eat less than you have to, or less than you should from what you took, and you keep it to the next day, there again, it's because you're not trusting God. So, you know, this idea is, you know, this is about trusting God. And the people struggle with this. Now, a lot of what's going on in the wilderness, and I'm on a tangent here, I apologize, I'll get back on track in just a second here, but a lot of what's going on in the wilderness with the Israelites, prior to Sinai and after Sinai, certainly during the 40 years of wandering, is teaching the Israelites how to trust God. Because they don't. I mean, he's rescued them out of Egypt, and that's fantastic. He's brought them across the Red Sea. He's leading them in the wilderness. They're going to have this experience at Sinai that nobody's ever had before in history. All these things are happening for them. But still, there is that fear that the next time he might not be there. The next time he might not do anything. And I think we are quick to judge them for that maybe sometimes, because we're used to living in a land where things are pretty, there's a lot of safety nets, there's a lot of opportunities, there's a lot of things to take care of it. But all you have to do is look at a dog like the one that I got recently and see how nervous she is about her food being taken away because she was out on her own for some period of time. And so when you give her food, she runs off and eats it somewhere, and then she comes back again. And when you give her stuff, she eats it as quick as she can or whatever, and she's just learning gradually how to trust that we're not going to take things away from her once we give them to her. But the Israelites are kind of in that same place. They've been slaves for a long, long time, during which time it sure seemed to them like God forgot about them, to the extent that they even remembered him at all. And so now he's back in the picture, and they're still nervous, and so he's wanting to teach them to trust him. And he does it a lot of different ways, but this is one of the critical ones because this happens every single day. And every single day is a great way to start to learn a lesson if you have to do it over and over again. So, they gathered as much of it, or they gathered it morning by morning, every man as much as he should eat, but when the sun grew hot, it would melt. So this is some weird bread, right? I mean, and there's some descriptions of like what this stuff is made out of, and it's kind of cool. I mean, like, let's see, it's like bread, but it's kind of like it's got honey mixed in with it, and it's kind of crumbly, but it also melts. It's actually kind of like a Frosty from Wendy's, if you think about it. It looks like a milkshake, but it's not a milkshake. Whatever's in there is not milk, because when you let it melt, it becomes a thick foam. And that's not what milk does when it, So anyway, it's something unusual. So anyway, now on the 6th day it says they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, then he said to them, "This is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning." Now, there are 2 really interesting things to note here. The first is, of course, that he's making sure that they gather twice as much on the 6th day, so that on the 7th day they will have that extra portion left over, so that they will not have to work, which in this case, I mean, literally, this is not hard work, going out and just gathering up some bread that's laying on the ground, because it's laying everywhere in the camp. But nevertheless, the principle stands, and there's no reason to need to do it, because there's a very simple plan in place for how to avoid this. So you don't have to do this kind of work. But there's another thing that's really interesting here, because you remember, what chapter are we in? Anybody remember what we were in a minute ago? Exodus 16. And where are the 10 Commandments? Exodus 20. So this is him talking about a Sabbath before God has ever said, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Now, that's not a typo or a mistake. Like I said, the concept of Sabbath pre-existed before the commandment was given, and it pre-existed even before this, the concept of a day of rest. But the idea of the Sabbath was introduced to the Israelites even before God said, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Imagine what a weird commandment that would be, It'd be like, don't murder, only nobody's ever murdered anybody before, so then God has to explain, okay, so here's what murder is. We have one of you hit another guy in the head with a shovel, and that guy fell down and never got up again. That would be murder. Don't do that. It would just seem really weird. So in the 10 Commandments, when God says, remember the Sabbath, he's not speaking in a vacuum to them. He's already explained what the Sabbath is here, and I would guess probably on some other occasions as well.
I think this also gives us an insight into what we commonly call the patriarchal age, before law, when we don't really know how God communicated with people, what his desires were. So obviously there was some communication, because Abraham, when he wrote Genesis, just kidding.
Maybe.
Anyway, when Genesis was written, the law was already in place, but it tells them that God consecrated that 7th day from the very beginning. And so somehow he had communicated that to the heads of the families throughout time.
And you have, if you look back even in distant history, you typically find a concept of a rest day or rest time across most cultures. Now, whether the slaves in Egypt would have been permitted that is a question, but they would have seen modeling of that probably. So let me do Steve, and then I'll come back to Barbara.
I was just going to say that it wasn't that mankind was lawless or did not know what God wanted. There's always been God's moral law. And the 10 Commandments becomes more of a written law, the law of Moses. But murder, when Cain murdered Abel, they already knew that was wrong.
Yes. Yeah, it wasn't like that was a surprise to anybody,
Right.
So, okay, Barbara.
Cain and Abel was what I was going to bring up, because they offered sacrifices, and there's nothing that told them, we don't have anything recorded of what they were supposed to do, but they evidently knew, because, Abel's was accepted and Cain's wasn't, and so he killed his brother because of that.
Right.
So there was sacrifices before, they got up and they were told all these sacrifices to do.
Right.
So there must have been something set up from the very beginning of what they knew
Right.
that they were supposed to do.
And whether that came as part of the knowledge that Adam and Eve were given or took in the garden, or whether it was something that God revealed to them as they, began to try to live a life outside of the garden. We don't really know that, but you're right. There are things like whether it's murder or whether it's whatever it takes to make a sacrifice pleasing. What that was, we don't know exactly, but it was always I was always told growing up, well, it was because Cain offered fruit, and Abel offered an animal, and that's why God accepted. And later on, I started learning about things like the grain offering and in the law of Moses, and I began to realize that might have been a little simplistic. But in any event, whatever the reason was, there was an understanding of what should have been done, and then there was an understanding on Cain's part that when God said sin is crouching at your door, that he knew what he was talking about. It wasn't like God failed to make himself clear to Cain, even though he didn't like lay it all out to him, you're going to attack your brother, whatever. So yeah, there's an awareness of this, and to the extent that when we talk about the Sabbath and the concept of the Sabbath, whether it's the seventh day or not, most major cultures have had a rest day. That has been a very normal thing. It's not just a Christian or a Jewish development. We can look back through history and see examples of this. So there is this idea of the rest day, and so but Moses articulates to the Israelites the idea. But here's perhaps where his becomes a little different, or where God's becomes a little different, because even here before the Ten Commandments are given, he says, tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. What does the holy mean? Set apart. So he's saying this day is set apart to the Lord. Now, my guess is, if you go back and look at cultures throughout history, well, there may be some sort of religious significance or religious rites that take place on rest days that it isn't necessarily consecrated to their deities, especially in multi-deity religions where you have lots of different gods. You wouldn't want to tick one of them off by dedicating a particular day to them. Linda.
Well, Genesis 2:2 talks about the seventh day God rests, and then he declared that day the Sabbath holy. So I think that's where it comes from.
That is true, and the complication we talked about it last week, I think, is that what is in Genesis chapter 2 is written down by Moses, which means that it's not easy to tell whether that's God having said to Adam and Eve, the Sabbath day is holy, or whether that's God having told Moses, this is why I made this is why the Sabbath day is holy, because I rested on the seventh day. And so Moses is writing it down and relating back to that. So I would agree, though, that there because of God's timeless nature, there's a continuity of what is going on here. It's not like there was, God did a day of rest and considered it a Sabbath, and then never mentioned it again until, Exodus 16, when he says it to the Israelites for the first time. So there's a continuity. It's just that how explicit that was made to the early humans is not as clear, because again, we've got Moses writing this as opposed to somebody keeping records all along. So, Linda?
But couldn't that be considered a necessary inference? I mean, that happened before he even created man, or talks about it. Genesis 2:3 talks about he declared that holy before, and then it goes into the creation thing. It just seems like it would be, God is consistent. It would be inferred from a necessary inference that that's where it came from.
What came from?
So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy,
right.
Because, yeah.
Right. Well, when the passage we looked at in Exodus, just at the very beginning of this stuff today, but in more detail last week, God actually says to Moses, the reason I'm doing this is because I rested on the seventh day. So there's no question that the two things are directly, causally connected to each other. What I'm saying, simply expressing, is it's not clear that necessarily Adam and Eve had all that explanation given to them. That they might have been told or come to understand that they should take the seventh day off, but God may or may not have called it a Sabbath and explained it to them that way, because we don't know, because it's Moses writing down the events. And so, for example, we know that God did not reveal himself as Yahweh to Abraham, and yet in conversations where God is talking to Abraham, the text says that the Lord, Yahweh, said to Abraham. And that's because Moses, writing it down, knows who the Lord is, and by his real name, and not just by a title. And so he writes it down that way. But that doesn't mean that Abraham knew the name of God at the time, because God explicitly says he didn't. So the people that are being written about in Genesis in particular may not have had the same knowledge about what was going on that Moses did when he wrote down their history for them. The same way that when we write about George Washington today, we can understand and know some things that are happening around him that he was completely unaware of at the time. So,
if you look at Genesis 9, some of the commandments were given to Noah when he entered the ark, like not to, however, you must not eat meat with its lifeblood in it. That's in the thing. It's you cannot murder. So some of the commandments they knew since Noah. They were recorded with Noah. God's covenant with Noah, and that's in Genesis 9.
Right. And I think there.
Whoever sheds human blood by humans, his blood will be shed, for God made humans in his image. So that they were already, but you will be fruitful and multiply, spread out over the earth and multiply in it. And then God said to Noah and his sons with him, understand that I am establishing my covenant with you and for your descendants after you.
And that's the covenant not to
And
destroy the
that's
earth.
already in Genesis 9. So
Right.
some of those laws of the Ten Commandments, they knew already.
Yes. I think that's true. And in the case of the aspects of flesh and the lifeblood, that would appear to be because prior to that, humans were not authorized to eat meat, the meat of living creatures. And so once God freed them from that limitation, he still wants to make clear that you still shouldn't eat meat with the lifeblood in it, and that blood is really important, and the shedding of blood is a criminal, a death warranting offense.
And also the clean and unclean animals. They knew that since Noah. Noah put 7 pairs of the clean ones and 1 pair of the unclean ones. How did he know that? So God told him. So they knew from the beginning some of those commandments.
Right. No, absolutely. How they knew them, we don't know for sure, but they did know things, yes. Penny?
It's just like in the New Testament where they didn't have the written Gospels yet. They had word of mouth. And
Right.
it's probably from Adam, there was probably word of mouth that went down through the generations. And Moses wrote it down.
Yeah.
So word of mouth, that's what I would say.
Okay.
That they probably knew a lot of this stuff
That is
already.
true, that the stories, and I think when you look at the fact that you have this thread of obedient people throughout history that goes through, even when things are really, really bad, that goes through Enoch and Noah and Shem and so on and so forth, you have the ones who are holding on to the teachings that Adam would have passed on, and Adam and Eve would have passed on to their children, of who God is, that he is to be worshipped, that he is to be honored, those sorts of things. Those would have been passed on, and through Noah and so on. Of course, then everybody got killed, so you have to start over again. But you have that same situation. As humanity expands, they start to turn away, but you still have that thread going forward. And more importantly, once you get past that point, you start to see God do some more direct interaction with certain people, like Abraham and his heirs and stuff like that. So I don't think there's any question that the awareness of what God wanted from people was something that existed in some fashion from, not from creation on, but from the fall of man and the exit from the garden. There was an awareness. Like I said, whether that was kind of given to Adam and Eve as part of the knowledge of good and evil, whether that was something that God explained to them, they certainly would have been aware of those things in the broad sense. And those would have been passed down, just like I think the creation story in Genesis chapter 1 is written the way that it is to be a what's called basically there's a term for it. Basically, it's a story song where you can remember your history because you sing it or it's poetic. Genesis, no, it's not a metaphor. It's not a metaphor. In Genesis chapter 1, if you look at the structure of Genesis chapter 1, even in English, you can tell that it's poetic. It's systematically repetitive on the first day, on the second day, and there was morning, there's evening, there's morning, there's evening, there's morning. It's highly repetitive. In Hebrew, it's even more poetic and repetitive. It's pretty obviously the sort of thing that would have been designed to be where you could tell it to your kids, and they would remember it the same way that our kids all can remember how to sing, 10 or 15 songs at least. That they've never seen written down in their lives. Some of them, if they even can't read, they can sing those songs back because they've sung them enough that they know them. So I think Genesis chapter 1 was designed to be that way, and that, if nothing else, was passed down generation after generation. I don't know the Sabbath and the reasons for the Sabbath, to what extent that was passed down from generation to generation. I don't know. The idea perhaps of honoring the Sabbath is something that would have been passed down, but a lot of this is speculation because we don't have the details of what really was told to those people, of what they actually did exactly. We know that by the time we get to Exodus, we have people who are not surprised, apparently, when Moses tells them that they're going to have a Sabbath. They seem to understand what that is, and what he's explaining to them isn't, here's what the word Sabbath means. What he's saying to them, here's the significance of the Sabbath. It's holy, it's set apart. This is something special. It's not the normal thing you think of. So, okay. So he tells them to put the stuff aside on the 6th day. They put the stuff aside until morning, as Moses had ordered, and it did not become foul, nor was there any worm in it. So God's not messing with them. That's good. Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none. So, anybody either remember the story or can guess what happens next?
They don't do it.
Well, no, I mean, actually, they did what they were supposed to do in terms of eating it, but some of them hadn't listened in the first place.
They went out.
It came out on the 7th day that some of the people went out together, but they found none. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my commandments and instructions? And Moses, I'm saying, look, it wasn't me. They failed to keep your commandments and instructions. See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, he gives you bread for 2 days on the 6th day. Remain every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. So the people rested on the 7th day. So, Mark?
I was going to say, this is like little kids.
It's exactly like little kids.
And he's bringing them along, and he's trying to build their faith in them. Just like our kids have faith in us, they're going to be taken care of by us.
Right.
For the most part, the world that today, we just don't know.
Right.
But for the most part, good parenting is part of this. You teach them something, and they'll forget the next day.
Right.
You teach them something, they forget again, and finally they'll catch on. Wait a second, I'm supposed to do this now. And so that's little kids, and I think a lot of this is that. These are barbarians,
Right.
pretty much. They're surviving, and they've come out of being slaves, just surviving, and now he's trying to teach them, okay, this is about faith, and this is about me being part of your life, and continually over and over trying to get them to understand
Right.
that. And it's like little kids, they just, maybe the next day it won't show up,
Right.
so I better get more. And it's our nature to be that way.
Right.
Hey,
And-
Mark, can you tell them that?
I already went through that.
That's your job now.
I really like the barbarian part.
You people are barbarians. I've told my students that once or twice. So Philistines, they didn't get that reference, so I had to go to something simpler and call them barbarians. But yeah, it is a repetitive process. And here again, you kind of understand. The group that's planning to go out together. Now, see, if it was simply about being prepared, though, I would have gathered two portions and been ready to go out instead of the 7th day. These ones obviously failed to prepare for that, so they maybe trusted themselves in the wrong way, And so anyway, it is very interesting to see this sort of teething process that the people go through to get the hang of this. So.
Two observations. One, God really demonstrates his wisdom in how he's dealt with them right along. Abraham was in Canaan. The Israelites ended up in Egypt, where God isolated them in the land of Goshen, I believe it was, and formed a nation that generated a bunch of slaves and barbarians and that sort of thing. But nonetheless, racially and spiritually, they were pure and they were a blank slate for God to write on.
Because they were around Egyptians who wanted nothing to do
Right,
with it. They
exactly.
would never
They were
intermarry,
shepherds.
the Egyptians would never intermarry with the
No.
with the Israelites, so.
And so now he's trying to form them into a nation physically, spiritually, politically, if you will,
Socially.
socially, also among themselves. And so he's doing all of that. The other observation, and I've never noticed this, remain every man in his place. That hits right at the heart of the fallacy of the Pharisees' Sabbath day's journey.
Right.
They weren't supposed to have a Sabbath, they were
Well,
supposed to stay home.
that's the thing, if there had been a journey, what they would have said is, okay, we can't go as far today as we normally do, but let's
Right.
go, a little ways,
Right.
But it's, everything just stays where it is, everybody just stays where they are, and you don't go on journeys. I don't know what that means in terms of, can you go visit your neighbor's tent? I assume, here again, I think this is one of those things where, to a certain extent, this is probably learned through practice. You've got, somebody who's kind of doing too much, and Moses, slaps him down and says, cool it. Somebody who's, confused asks questions. I mean, that is the one place where this happens in the New Testament, and it happens sometimes in the Old Testament, where we forget that it's easy to go in and read Corinthians and look at a really messed up church and Paul's explanation of what to do if you're a really messed up church, or in Ephesians or in Galatians or whatever it is. The problem is that in a lot of cases, Paul will give you an answer, as he does in Romans and Corinthians. Okay, say, look, if you got a problem with who's eating food, just stop eating the food, we've solved that problem. We're like, well, that's great. And if we were still having problems about who's eating what, we would probably have a great solution for that now. Unfortunately, that's not our problem right now. And the thing that we forget is that in the moment, they could go ask questions. And then they could pass those answers on to their kids. So what it looked like would have been a product of people saying, what does this mean? How does this look? Maybe doing something that goes a little too far and being told not to do it, or doing something that goes a little way too far and being executed for it. But either way you learn. Well, other people learn anyway, you might not, but in any event, there's a learning process here, and to some extent, the manna is part of that learning process. In the case of the manna, it's more problematic though, because there God is actually saying to them, this is what I want you to do. And when they don't do it, then it's very different from saying, somebody coming to Moses and saying, hey, I'm trying to understand this. I've never really observed God to be an entity who gets mad when people ask questions who are genuinely trying to understand. You don't see that with Jesus. When the young man comes to Jesus and says, what do I have to do to be saved? When the lawyer comes to Jesus and says, what's the most important command? And when Jesus responds back to him, he says, that's a good answer. Jesus doesn't get mad at those people. He gets mad at people that are coming and they're trying to use questions to distort the truth or to disrupt the learning process of others, stuff like that. And so I'm confident that there was much more nuance to this than we will ever know, because we weren't there to ask the questions, and there wasn't a need or a sense of a need to write all that stuff down. For one thing, you had 635 commands already. Moses might have felt like that's probably enough, He doesn't need to add more. And the problem is, the more detail you give, the more detail people want. That's why the Arizona Revised Statutes, take up, a good half of this wall at this point, they just keep growing. So, okay. So, some of the specific exemptions or rules about what you could not or should not do on the Sabbath. In Exodus chapter 35, for 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a holy day, a Sabbath of complete rest of the Lord. Notice that word complete there. That kind of goes with what Kim was pointing out. Everybody stayed where he was. It's complete rest. Now, again, when you talk about like the guy whose son or his oxen or donkey falls down a well, you can't rest if something valuable to you is in jeopardy like that. Something you need, not just something like this you like or you want, but something you need or that you're related to is in jeopardy like that. You wouldn't be able to rest effectively if that was going on. But in general, rest means cessation of labor. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. So he says, you shall not kindle a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. So that's one of the explicit things you're not supposed to do, which means that the night before the Sabbath, one of the things that a lot of times you'd have somebody set aside in your household to do is make sure the fire doesn't go out. Because if the fire goes out, we're not going to be cooking anything, or heating anything up, or keeping warm tomorrow, because we can't light a fire. And in fact, it's kind of interesting. He says, you shall not kindle a fire in any of your dwellings on the Sabbath day. Why would he be specific about in your dwellings?
Sacrifice.
There you go. There you go. Sacrifices go on all the time. Sacrifice trumps Sabbath day. So if he said you should not kindle a fire in any of your dwellings, you should not kindle a fire on the Sabbath day, immediately there would have been somebody like me with their hand raised going, what about the sacrifice, And so he's building in the answer to the question that he knows people would ask if he didn't say it that way. So can't kindle a fire in your dwellings. Thus says the Lord, take heed for yourselves and do not carry any load on the Sabbath day or bring anything in through the gates of Jerusalem. This is in Jeremiah. You shall not bring a load out of your houses on the Sabbath day, nor do any work, but keep the Sabbath day holy as I commanded your forefathers. Yet they did not listen or incline their ears, but stiffened their necks in order not to take correction, or listen or take correction. So here again, you're not supposed to carry a load. Now the Pharisees did the same thing with this. Well, what does a load mean? So and so they would so here's the reason. Okay, so how old would a baby get before you would expect it to start walking on its own? So however much a baby weighs must not be a load, since mothers are allowed to carry their babies around on the Sabbath. So whatever that number is, everybody can carry that, right? Because that just makes sense if you're being legalistic about it. That kind of logic is what they used there. So you're not supposed to carry a load, not supposed to bring anything through the gates of Jerusalem. Now that was pretty unequivocal. There's not any, I guess you could throw something over the gate maybe and maybe get away with it there. But no, you were not supposed to bring anything else. So that was one thing that they did. They basically shut the gates and you didn't come in around on the Sabbath. Bad thing if you're on the wrong side of the gates when they shut at 6 o'clock in the morning. You're kind of up the creek at that point. So, okay. In Leviticus, this shall be a permanent statute for you. In the 7th month and the 10th day of the month, you shall humble your souls and not do any work. Now we're talking about Sabbaths that are special Sabbaths. For it is on this day that atonement shall be made for you to cleanse you. You will be clean from all your sins before the Lord. It is to be a Sabbath of solemn rest for you, that you may humble your souls. It is a permanent statute. So we're transitioning over here. We're just going to stop here because it sounds like the kids are getting, the natives are getting restless. The barbarians, perhaps.
Yeah.
The barbarians are at the gates, we might even say. But we'll stop here, with just the beginning of this thought. So the Day of Atonement is one of the days that's specifically called out as a day, as a Sabbath day. So they're not supposed to work or do anything on the Sabbath. Now, it's interesting because in the Day of Atonement, they all are supposed to gather together in Jerusalem, but you're supposed to be there before, actually at the tabernacle or then later the temple, but you're supposed to be there already. You're not supposed to be running to Jerusalem. I'm almost here. Don't start without me. Don't kill the lamb yet. I haven't made it. Actually, some lamb. Don't shut the gate. That's really bad, but don't shut the gate. Too late, So there's a Day of Atonement, and we'll go through and look at some of the other ones like this as well in a little bit here. Steve?
Well, I'm going to ask a question, and you may need to answer at another time. So most of the Old Testament to me is a foreshadowing of something that's going to come. And I'm trying to rationalize what the Sabbath, all the Sabbath days, all the Sabbath holidays, how does that relate into our Christian era at all? Or does it?
All right, let me make sure that I'm not going to talk about that later anyway. Okay. We're going to talk some about this, but let me give you sort of a brief preview of this. So, look at something we were talking about a minute ago. Let me go back to this. Where is it? Yeah, this one here. Okay. We talked about why they wouldn't do what they were supposed to do. And Mark pointed out that these are basically barbarians or slaves in their thinking, and they're not trusting God because they don't have enough willingness to trust in God to do that. So God is giving them both a rest day, and they have to trust Him that He's going to provide them with food, that it's going to work out, that they're not going to be able to work or do anything. And when they go into the land, that means they're not going to be able to farm on that day, they're not going to be able to raise animals on that day, they're not going to be able to do any of the labor things that they would normally do, that many farmers would do on any day, because you've got to do those things. They have to trust God that He's going to make things work anyway. Does that not have something to do with us and the way we live today? And the lack of trust we have a lot of times, that if we take our foot off the gas for a minute, that everything's going to disintegrate around us, and that we're not willing to take enough time, as Ken and others have pointed out, to change our focus away from all this stuff going on around us and look at what we need to do to make our relationships strong with God, to make our church's relationship strong with God. If we're not able to do that, then isn't that the same failing of trust? Doesn't that come from the same place? So I think, and there's some other applications as well, I think, but to me, that's one of the ones that really comes out of what we're talking about today, is that willingness to trust that God is going to make it okay when we do those things is a huge element of success in our Christian walk. Let me do Sylvia, then I'll let Ken kind of wrap it up here, so be thinking and make it good.
If you look at today, how many people think they have to work 7 days a week? Otherwise, their business falls apart, their household falls apart, everything falls apart. By 30, 40, they're wiped out because they're sick, they have heart attacks, they are done. And it's the same principle. We do need some rest. And we do need to have our mindset of Him, and to, if that is Saturday, if that is Sunday, but honor Him and get the strength back.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. We can't simply run all the time. You know, and our society would love for us to run all the time, even on the days that we have off. And more and more of our businesses would like to be able to contact you whenever and expect you to respond whenever, because that's what they want. And there's a trust that goes into being able to say, you know what, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to let my life be run by the things that are not the way they work. All right, Ken.
Okay, Steve, the way I would answer your question is this unbelievably powerful continuity in the Word of God. In the very beginning, God establishes the concept of the Sabbath rest. In Hebrews, it tells us that there yet remains a Sabbath rest for God's people.
See, that was the part I wasn't going to talk about.
God's Sabbath becomes an eternal Sabbath of rest in the very presence of God.
Yes. And we'll go, you know, it's okay. We'll go into that much more, and we'll go into how the thread that connects that through Jesus' sacrifice and the Day of Atonement and lead us into that. Because all of those things are tied together. And Jesus' atonement, and that's why I use the Day of Atonement as the first one we looked at here, is because Jesus' atonement is the ultimate rest day, because it gives us rest from what? Sin, which is huge, obviously. Okay, we got to stop because we're over time, and also because I'm going to give away all the secrets of the rest of this.